Greetings and welcome to the Kentucky Watershed Academy. In Module 1 of the Academy, we're providing an overview of the Clean Water Act and related laws. In this presentation, we'll be overviewing specifically the Clean Water Act and water quality standards. Kentucky is indeed a water-rich state with over 92,000 miles of streams, 1,000 square miles of wetlands, and 350 square miles of lakes or reservoirs. Many states have disputing claims about who has the most miles of streams or navigable waterways or rivers or coastline. Part of the problem with these differing statistics stems from how a stream is defined, the scale for identifying a stream, and whether it is total miles or length per area. However, what we can say is that Kentucky has abundant water resources. Further, water is central to Kentuckian survival and enjoyment. Our water resources are valuable for a number of different uses, including drinking water, industrial uses, and thermoelectric power plant cooling, fishing, swimming, boating, and then support for ecological functions and aquatic life. Water laws enable public agencies to provide protection of our water resources. But it is also critical that citizens and water professionals like you are familiar with these laws so that you can provide assistance to the responsible government agencies and help them do their jobs. A number of laws have been enacted to protect water resources for different uses. We're mainly going to focus on the Clean Water Act, but we will also touch on some of the other water-related laws. These include the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which ensures that all branches of government consider environmental impacts when taking federal actions that impact the environment. The Endangered Species Act makes sure that endangered species, including aquatic species, are protected. The Safe Drinking Water Act looks at the quality of drinking water, focusing on all uses with actual or potential designated drinking water use. That could be either surface or groundwater, and establish minimum standards for tap water. The Toxic Substance Control Act gave the EPA authority to require testing and restriction of chemical substances, including PCBs. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act gave the authority to control hazardous substances from cradle to grave and also addressed underground storage tanks. The Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act regulated environmental effects of coal mining and created a program to regulate active mines and reclaim abandoned ones. The Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA, allowed for the cleanup of uncontrolled and abandoned hazardous waste sites, spills, and contamination. Also in 1994, the Kentucky General Assembly passed the Kentucky Agricultural Water Quality Act. The goal of this act was to protect surface and groundwater resources from pollution as a result of agriculture or forestry activities. These are just some of the many laws that help protect our water quality. In tracing the history of the Clean Water Act, we need to look at some pre-existing laws. The River and Harbors Act of 1899 prohibited discharge of refuse into navigable water other than what was flowing from the streets or sewers. It was reported in 1945 that over 3,500 communities pumped 2.5 billion tons of raw sewage into streams, lakes, and coastal waters every day. The Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948 developed plans for reducing pollution and improving sanitary conditions. It also authorized the Surgeon General of the Public Health Service to prepare comprehensive programs for eliminating or reducing the pollution of interstate waters and tributaries and improving the sanitary conditions of surface and underground waters. It also authorized the Federal Works Administration to assist states, municipalities, and interstate governments in constructing treatment plants to provide discharges of inadequately treated sewage and other waste into interstate waters or tributaries. In June 1969, an oil slick on the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, caused the river to catch on fire. The river had been polluted from decades of industrial waste from along its shores, and it flowed into Lake Erie. This event became symbolic of the need to address out-of-control pollution and help motivate the passage of the Clean Water Act. It was described as the river that oozes rather than flows, and in which a person does not drown but decays, by Time magazine. From 1968 to 1970, pollution surveys showed losses in the fishing industry due to high levels of DDT in fish and high levels of bacteria. In July of 1970, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare reported that 30% of drinking water samples had chemicals exceeding the recommended public health service limits. In 1972, what came to be known as the Clean Water Act was introduced actually as an amendment to the Water Pollution Control Act, and it was passed by overriding President Nixon's veto. It established ways to create water quality standards and a permitting authority, which became the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. The Clean Water Act provided the basic structure for regulating discharges of pollutants into waters of the United States. Through the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, the EPA had authority to implement pollution controls. It became unlawful for any person to discharge pollutants from a point source into navigable waters unless a permit was first obtained. The Clean Water Act also required water quality standards to be established for all contaminants to surface waters. The overall goal of the Clean Water Act was to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. This had several sub-goals. One was to eliminate the discharge of pollutants into navigable waters by 1985. Number two, to achieve water quality, which provides for, among other things, protection and propagation of fish and wildlife, and recreation in and on the water by 1983. And three, to prohibit the discharge of toxic pollutants in toxic amounts. These obviously were very ambitious goals, but it shows the scope of the law and the intent of the thinking at the time. The Clean Water Act has been amended 3 times, in 1977, 1981, and 1987. The intent to assure improved water quality remained, but the ambitious goals of the 1972 Act proved too difficult to achieve. These amendments adjusted some of the timelines, and the rigid command and control approach was modified to a more flexible approach that emphasized partnerships among all levels of government. An example of this increased flexibility is the 1977 amendment, which allowed permittees to achieve wastewater effluent standards according to available technology. Previously, the permittee would have required to meet a certain discharge standard regardless of technological feasibility or cost. Prior to 1987, the emphasis had been focusing on addressing point source pollution, but by 1987, it had become apparent that significant amounts of pollution were coming from diffuse sources, which were more difficult to identify. Thus, the 1987 Clean Water Act amendments attempted to address these additional sources through Section 319 authorizations. The 319 grant program provides 60% of the costs for non-point source management projects through federal funding. The recipient must provide the remaining 40% of the cost. This is intended to address these non-point source pollution sources. It is helpful at this point to pause and reflect on the balance of powers between federal and state government. In our system, some limited powers are reserved for the federal government, while other powers remain at the state level, with some powers being shared between them. How does this apply to water laws? Well, the Clean Water Act is a federal law, but Kentucky has administrative regulations and regulatory standards that often mirror these laws. The federal government has a say in the waters of the United States, but Kentucky has a say in the waters of the Commonwealth, and a jurisdictional determination is necessary to understand who has a say. Under the Clean Water Act, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System was established, but authority for the implementation has been delegated to Kentucky, and therefore we have the Kentucky Discharge Elimination System, KPDES. Federal law applies to interstate commerce and navigable waters, while Kentucky law can apply to interstate waters as well as all other waters. Federal law requires designated uses, but Kentucky actually sets what those uses are. Federal law requires technology-based limits, but Kentucky sets those limits. Federal funding is provided for revolving funds for water and wastewater infrastructure, but Kentucky allocates these funds. And the powers are shared, including enforcement, construction permits, and water quality standards. So what we can see here is, although the Clean Water Act is a federal law, the EPA has delegated the primary responsibilities to the states. See in this statement, the Congress recognizes, preserves, and protects the primary responsibilities and rights of the states to prevent, reduce, and eliminate pollution, and to plan the development and use of land and water resources. To evaluate the Clean Water Act, it is important that we have an understanding of the different types of water pollution. Poor water quality may have a specific and observable source, such as a sewage treatment plant outfall or an industrial discharge. These are referred to as point sources of pollution. However, not all sources of pollution will be easily identifiable. Most pollution is carried into streams by rain and snowmelt running off of the ground surface. This is referred to as non-point source pollution. Non-point source pollution is from land that is built on or paved, farmed, or it can be bare soil as well. The Clean Water Act has been very successful at addressing the point sources of pollution, but reduction of non-point pollution has proven much more difficult. Why do you think non-point sources pose a greater challenge? Well, some of the reasons include the widespread and diffuse nature of these sources make it difficult to target control measures. The non-point source management practices, often referred to as best management practices or BMPs, are mainly voluntary, and so that adds to the difficulty. And there's a lot of collaboration and coordination required to make a significant improvement in water quality. And therefore, part of the reason why we are putting together this Kentucky Watershed Academy is to help train on how to address these non-point sources in the state of Kentucky. When we look at Kentucky's water resources, of the water bodies that have been assessed, over half are threatened or impaired, and 2/3 are polluted by non-point sources. This shows the extent of the impact of non-point source pollution throughout our state. The Clean Water Act can be outlined through its titles, which kind of identify the major areas, and then it has subsections, which is typically a 3-digit code that relates to those titles. Some of these will become very familiar to you as a watershed coordinator, and some of these areas you will probably not reference very often. So what we want to do is just kind of build that structure by looking through these titles and some of the major programs and details that you can find underneath those. So Title 1 is the research and related programs. There's a few items there, but that's probably not one that you'll reference a whole lot. Title 2 is grants for construction of wastewater treatment works. So looking at facility plans. Title 3 is where you'll find a lot of the programs that you'll reference on a regular basis. That includes effluent limits, different types of standards and implementation plans. For instance, you may have heard of a 303D list of impaired water bodies. That's because in this section, you're going to have your designated uses, your criteria, and your list of impaired waters, as well as your TMDLs. Total maximum daily load for a water body. Section 305, you'll see a 305B report, and that refers to this section of the Clean Water Act where it has a assessment of the state's water bodies. You may also see some reference to toxic and pretreatment in this section, or inspections or monitoring. And then there's the 319 section, which is on non-point source management program, which is near and dear to hearts of watershed coordinators. Title 4 looks at permits and licenses. So here you can find things like certification of wastewater treatment plant operators, or the NPDES system, or the 404 permit for dredging or fill materials into water bodies. In Title V, you can find just general provisions. You probably won't reference that very much. And then in Title VI, you can see the State Water Pollution Control Revolving Funds. Okay, so with that outline, we want to walk you through the titles and some of the important sections of the Clean Water Act. And we'll begin with Title I, which relates to research and related programs. Most of these are going to be utilized by the state, the Kentucky Division of Water itself. But some of the items include Section 104, which provides grant money to the states to conduct that water quality improvement research. And then Section 106 provides monies to the states for water pollution controls. Under Title II, the grants for construction of treatment works, it authorized federal funding grants to assist cities with meeting the Clean Water Act's pollution control requirements. So this funding mainly focuses on the design and construction of municipal treatment facilities. Funding is allocated to the states based on the state's population numbers and a national survey of estimated sewage treatment funding needs. In the late 80s and early 90s, there was a shift to allocating more of the responsibility to the state and local governments for wastewater treatment expenditures. As a result, more federal funding has been transferred to the states via the State Water Pollution Control Revolving Fund program, which is a loan program rather than a grant program, and thus needs to be repaid. This shift to loans has proven to be especially difficult for smaller municipalities that have more difficulty repaying project loans. For example, there have been several recent incidents in Kentucky of overflows of inadequately treated sewage flowing into streams from municipal plants from which there is no easy solution to pay for repairs or upgrades. Now let's move on to Title III, Standards and Enforcement, where we're going to spend a little more time. Under Title III, we see many of the Division of Water's responsibilities, which include monitoring, assessment, permitting, compliance and enforcement, and planning. In this presentation, we mainly want to focus on the aspect that most directly relate to watershed planning and management and your roles in those efforts. And so that entails monitoring and assessment as well as planning. The permitting and compliance will be covered in a later section of Module 1. To achieve its goals, the Clean Water Act requires that all discharges into the nation's waters are unlawful unless they're authorized by an associated permit. The Division of Water's Kentucky Pollutant Discharge Elimination System branch oversees this permitting requirement for the state. In order to regulate the pollution concentrations containing effluent, that is the discharges, from point source permittees, the following approach is utilized. First, a permit is issued specifying the allowable pollutant levels that can be discharged. These levels are based on available technology. The permittee self-monitors to assure the effluents are meeting permit requirements and submits regular discharge monitoring reports, or DMRs. The Division of Water field staff can show up to sample effluent and ensure that reporting is accurate. Permits are issued for 5 years, at which time they must be renewed for the discharge to continue. As permitting shifted to better address non-point sources, water quality-based effluent standards were developed. So technology-based versus water quality-based. These standards were tied to water quality criteria that would enable waters to be used for specific uses. For example, bacteria levels had to be within certain measurable levels to ensure safe recreational use, like swimming or boating. Permits were structured to help meet those levels. This next level of permitting required additional work in order to address existing or ambient water quality status through monitoring efforts and establish appropriate criteria to meet designated uses, to develop ways to look holistically at watersheds that included all point and non-point sources of pollution. The watershed approach to managing water quality evolved as a way to encompass these needs. In the following slides, we're going to look at these aspects of the Clean Water Act Title III, which are attempts to measure and improve upon water quality in a more holistic, comprehensive way, utilizing a watershed approach. Under the Water Quality Standards Program, Kentucky has established designated water uses. These uses describe all of the expected water uses or potential uses and enable water quality criteria to be established so that they can safely occur. We're going to examine these different designated uses in the following slides. Primary contact recreational use applies to all Kentucky water bodies. It includes the use for swimming or other activities where your head can potentially go underwater and you're likely to ingest water. The indicator is Escherichia coli, or E. coli, which is a bacteria indicator organism. That is, it's an indicator of risk of coming in contact with some sort of pathogen that can make you sick. Samples for determining the support are collected either 6 times per year between May and October, that's the recreational season, or 5 samples are collected within 30 days during that period. The instantaneous criteria is 240 colonies per 100 milliliters. That's for the monthly samples. And to look at a geometric mean, the criteria is 130 colonies per 100 milliliters when you collect those 5 samples in 30 days. pH must also be within the range of 6 to 9 to demonstrate support for the use. Secondary contact recreation also applies to all Kentucky water bodies and refers to the use that would be like fishing, boating, or wading, in which there may be contact with the skin or through splashing, water may be ingested, but the head is not expected to go underwater. Fecal coliform is the indicator for this use, and the criteria applies year-round. And for lakes, algal growth or nuisance algal blooms or high suspended sediments, they are also considered when accessing the water for this use. All Kentucky water bodies also have aquatic life use. For streams, this is assessed by looking at the biological community to determine if it has a healthy balance of different animals that live in the water. Chemical samples can also be used in these evaluations. Different criteria are used for streams that are classified as cold water or warm water. Warm water is the default aquatic life assessment classification, with cold water being a special use waters, and they're specifically related to support of trout populations on a year-round basis. For lakes, large boatable water bodies and reservoirs are monitored and assessed based on looking at multiple chemical data samples, both conventional and non-toxic, in order to screen to see if they exceed criteria routinely. Reservoirs are monitored during the growing season, as this is the time that the trophic condition is expressed. Domestic water supply designated use applies to the source water at the point of intake. The use support is determined by the treatment plant's compliance with the maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, in the finished water. An annual average of quarterly samples is evaluated for use support. If an average exceeds the associated MCL, the water does not support the domestic water supply usage. The MCL is the legal threshold limit on the amount of a substance that's allowed in public water systems under the Safe Drinking Water Act. MCL results are reported to consumers in annual reports from the drinking water provider that are called the Consumer Confidence Report. While not technically listed as a designated use, fish consumption is assessed by comparing the concentrations of certain contaminants, such as mercury and PCBs, that are in the fish tissue rather than the water body itself, with set standards. Advisories are issued on the amount of certain fish that is safe to eat when the contaminant levels have the potential to harm people eating them, particularly for vulnerable populations such as children under 6 years old or women of childbearing age. Outstanding State Resource Waters, or OSRWs, is a designated use that describes streams or lakes that have unique features that are worthy of special legal protection. This can include streams that or lakes that have threatened or endangered species. Reference reaches are also least impacted streams. They are not necessarily pristine, but they represent streams that have been least impacted by human activities in the region. And thus they represent the best available conditions and can be used as benchmarks for comparisons with other streams within the area. You can find the OSRWs and other special use waters online at a special site for special use waters designated by the Division of Water. This includes the outstanding national resource waters, cold water aquatic habitat, exceptional waters, reference reaches, state wild rivers, and federal wild and scenic rivers. Another part of the water quality standards program are the criteria, which can be nutrients, metals, bacteria concentrations in the water, biological or habitat assessment scores, or other types of assessments. The Clean Water Act requires that the assessment standards are reviewed every 3 years in what's called the triennial review process. This allows for stakeholder input in potential revisions to these standards and criteria. Kentucky's water quality criteria are described in 401 KAR 1031, which is accessible online. This slide summarizes the major sections of these administrative regulations that pertain to a number of uses and criteria. Within the water quality standards, there are different types of criteria that are established. One of those types is narrative criteria. And here we have one of these examples. Surface water shall not be aesthetically or otherwise degraded by substances that form objectionable deposits or float as debris, scum, or oil, and so on. You can see the point of this narrative criteria is to provide a description and not necessarily a number. Whereas narrative criteria uses words to set standards, numeric criteria uses numbers. And there's a number of different approaches to these criteria. Chemical and bacteriological criteria will typically have a concentration over a specific period of time that occurs on a set frequency. Habitat and biological indicators require field surveys during which the species are identified and counted, visual features are observed, and then an index score is calculated. These scores are then compared against regional reference reaches. Habitat and biology are assessed via indicators, and these standards have not been promulgated through the regulatory process as criteria, and as such, these numbers for the assessments are not explicitly stated in the administrative regulations. Finally, whole toxicity testing exposes aquatic organisms in laboratory settings to different dilutions of the pollutant discharge water itself to evaluate the direct toxicity to aquatic species. This is useful when the combined effect of pollution may be greater than any individual contaminant itself. When looking at water quality criteria, you may see differences in criteria based on the toxicity of pollutants. That is, the levels that are harmful for humans or aquatic life. Criteria may be established based on acute levels versus chronic levels. Acute levels are measured in terms of hours, whereas chronic looks at over a long period of times, in days. Acute levels are assessing what's the 1 hour exposure, for instance, in which you might have a harmful effect. So these more immediate impacts with a burst of pollution through the environment. Chronic impacts look at long-term exposures to a chemical over a period of time. For instance, 96 hours exposure in which there's no harmful effect. So this is when pollution may accumulate or concentrate over time in organisms. Acute and chronic criteria are applied to the drinking water and aquatic life use assessments. Because of variability in bacteriological sampling, criteria can be established based on the frequency at which the samples have been collected. For instance, for primary contact recreation, a higher standard is set for an instantaneous sample, 240 colony forming units, or CFU, per 100 milliliters, whereas if 5 samples are collected within 30 days, The geometric mean of these samples is compared to a lower level, 130 colony-forming units per 100 milliliters. Bacteria criteria are used to assess both primary and secondary contact uses. In this table, we see some examples of chemical criteria from the water quality standards. The human health criteria applies to source water, so drinking supply use, whereas the acute and chronic levels apply to warm water aquatic habitat criteria. In some cases, a direct number is given, such as arsenic has 340 micrograms per liter for the acute concentrations. In other cases, such as cadmium, the toxicity depends on the hardness of the water, and so a formula is given in order to calculate that what the toxicity level should be based on the hardness. For biological indicators, Kentucky is divided into different geologic regions, which have different influences on the types of plants and animals present in and around streams that exist in those regions. The different areas resulting from these influences are called bioregions. The 4 bioregions in Kentucky are the mountains, MT, the bluegrass, BG, the pennyroyal, PR, and the Mississippi Valley Interior River Lowland, MVIR. These bioregions support different types and numbers of macroinvertebrates or fish in the streams that are located in those areas, and therefore different criteria apply. Water quality and standards also include an anti-degradation policy for protection of existing good water quality. Anti-degradation applies parameter by parameter and use by use. If 6 designated uses are assigned to a water body, and 5 of those uses are impaired, anti-degradation policies still apply to the protection of the 1 remaining use. Likewise, if pollution levels are greater or worse than the criteria for 28 of the 30 parameters, anti-degradation would still apply to the 2 remaining parameters. There are 3 levels of protection under anti-degradation, as shown in the chart in the figure: Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. Tier 1 is the floor or baseline. The State Water Quality Agency should not allow a new source that will result in a loss of an existing use if it can be prevented. There's no free fall to just barely meeting criteria, not an automatic right to be able to discharge just because the stream can handle a little bit more load. If a discharge will cause substantial degradation, even if it does not result in the loss of a use, they must justify that a discharge A cannot be avoided and B that it is necessary for economic or social development. That's Tier 2. And Tier 3 says that if it's an outstanding resource water, there is no decline that's allowed, no degradation that's allowed for those waters. The practical application of water quality standards is that if these standards are exceeded, remember we're talking about water quality standards, not technology-based standards, but if water quality standards are exceeded, this does not actually produce a related enforcement action. Instead, exceedances result in the stream, river, or reservoir being listed on the 303D list of impaired water bodies. Then a TMDL report will need to be developed to further assess the degree of impairment, the pollutant contributors, and then outline the management activities needed to correct the problem. Also, any KPDES permits for discharges into the impaired water body will need to be adjusted so that those discharges do not contribute to the water quality violation. The KPDES permit may also need to be amended so that the pollutant releases are minimized in accordance with the TMDL management recommendations. In summary, if water quality monitoring shows that pollutant levels need to be reduced to meet standards, the avenues of action include TMDLs, watershed plans, or the combined implementation of various state, federal, and local programs, as well as private initiatives to correct the problem. To complete this presentation, we wanted to briefly touch on the Waters of the United States, or WOTUS discussion. This is important because it establishes the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act over the waters of the United States. The WOTUS subject has been hotly debated, with some wanting more comprehensive protections on water quality, and others resisting the regulatory implications. There's also some confusion. For instance, what constitutes a stream versus a ditch? If a farmer builds a pond for cattle near a stream, but they want to remove it, do they then need a permit to do so? What about groundwater? Does a vernal pool count as a jurisdictional wetland? Differing views of jurisdiction led to multiple Supreme Court cases. Rulings in 1986 and 88 specified that the Clean Water Act applied to navigable waters that could be used for commerce as well as impoundments, adjacent wetlands, and non-navigable tributaries. The Rapanos Supreme Court case in 2007 clarified specific waters that would need to be assessed by the EPA and the U.S. Army Corps for jurisdiction. These agencies will be responsible for determining whether or not the water body has a significant nexus or connection with traditionally navigable waters. This is largely related to the permanency of the tributary or wetland. This ruling further stated that agencies would generally not assert authority over swales, erosional features, or man-made ditches. Several other Supreme Court decisions indicated the need for further clarification. In 2015, in order to address some of that confusion, the Clean Water Rule was issued. This was an attempt to define the federal protection with a more consistent approach. However, in 2017, an executive order required the EPA and the Army Corps to review and rescind or revise the rule. So in February 2018, a new rule was published, but it was delayed until February 2020 to give agencies time to reconsider the definition of the waters of the United States. The final rule was made effective on June 22nd of 2020. In the final rule, there are 4 general categories of what constitutes a water of the United States. 1. Territorial seas and traditionally navigable waters. 2. Perennial and intermittent tributaries that contribute surface flow to these territorial seas or traditionally navigable waters. Number 3. Certain lakes, ponds, and impoundments of jurisdictional waters that would be under 1 or 2. And number 4, wetlands adjacent to other jurisdictional waters. As a clarification of what a tributary means, it's defined as a river, stream, or similar naturally occurring surface water channel that contributes surface water flow to a territorial sea or traditionally navigable water in a typical year, either directly or indirectly through other tributaries, jurisdictional lakes, ponds, or impoundments, or adjacent wetlands. A tributary must be perennial or intermittent in a typical year. The alteration or the relocation of a tributary does not modify its jurisdictional status as long as it continues to be perennial or intermittent and contributes surface water flow to a traditionally navigable water or a territorial sea. A tributary does not lose its jurisdictional status if it contributes surface water flow to a downstream jurisdictional water in a typical year through a channelized, non-jurisdictional surface water feature. For example, a culvert or a tunnel or something like that. The term tributary includes a ditch that is either relocates a tributary, is constructed in a territory, or is constructed in an adjacent wetland as long as the ditch is perennial or intermittent and contributes surface water flow to a traditionally navigable water. You can see there's quite a bit of language in order to clarify what is included as a water of the U.S. The rule also excludes, among other things, groundwater, including groundwater drained through the subsurface drainage systems, ephemeral features, so ephemeral streams that only flow in direct response to precipitation. So that means ephemeral streams, swales, gullies, rills, and pools. Diffuse stormwater runoff or directional sheet flow, and ditches that are not traditionally navigable waters tributary or are not constructed in adjacent wetlands subject to certain limitations. It also excludes stormwater control features constructed or excavated in upland or non-jurisdictional waters to treat, infiltrate, or store stormwater runoff. So while the federal jurisdiction, for example, no longer includes ephemeral streams, the state definition still does. Uh, the definition of the waters of the Commonwealth includes any and all rivers, streams, creeks, lakes, ponds, impounding reservoirs, springs, wells, marshes, and all bodies of surface or underground water, natural or artificial, situated wholly or partly or bordering upon the Commonwealth and its jurisdiction. So this means that there will be differences going forward as to state versus federal permitting and when that they are required. So we hope that this presentation has helped provide you with a understanding of the Clean Water Act, its history, scope, and its applicability, and how still some items are being debated and what they mean and worked out on a day-to-day basis. We look forward to delving in more so into some of the components of the Clean Water Act further in the following presentations of Module 1, and we hope that you'll join us. Thank you.